I'm Tasneem Essop, and you're listening to Just Access, The Real Transition, a podcast from PARI, the Public Affairs Research Institute. In the previous episode, we began our conversation with economist and researcher Dr. Tracy Ledger about what access really means in South Africa. We heard that connection is not the same as dignity, because when households cannot afford to use enough electricity or water to live and work, rights exist on paper, but exclusion remains the lived reality. In this episode, we go deeper into how the system produces that exclusion. We return to Dr. Tracy Ledger, whose work shows how South Africa's revenue-driven service model has turned basic rights into commodities, and why affordability has become the front line of justice. We also look at how outages, slow repairs, and uneven investment in infrastructure create a two-tier system of reliability, where some communities can cope and others are left to endure.
So there's a couple of things at play here that make the situation much more difficult for poor households. The first thing is that obviously it's much more difficult for poorer households and micro enterprises to adopt coping strategies for water and electricity outages. If you're a woman who runs a small sort of hairdressing business, you can't really afford to buy a generator to take you through the power outage and water storage when there isn't any water. So it's much more difficult for poorer households and these micro enterprises to have coping strategies. So they are much more disproportionately impacted by outages of services than wealthier households and bigger businesses. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that it's quite clear that both Eskom and the municipalities, whether it's water or electricity, are much slower to fix broken infrastructure in poorer areas. And at one stage, I think there was a policy, I can't remember whether it was an Eskom policy or a local government policy, but there was definitely a policy that if the payment rate for electricity in an area was below a certain level, then in fact they wouldn't go and fix the infrastructure. So people are using the infrastructure outages as a reason to deprive people of access to the services, to try and force people to pay for the services. The other issue as well is that when we have a look at the issue of load reduction in many township areas. So townships were envisaged as dormitory areas with a very clear kind of spatial planning of single family residences and then hostels. And what has happened is that the densification of townships has completely outstripped the ability of the infrastructure in those areas to support it. Now, when that's happened in places like Sandton or Rosebank, then more infrastructure has been put in, largely because those big developers, the city can make people pay more for that development. But we haven't seen the same increase in infrastructure in township areas. So obviously we have overloading of the systems. Municipalities like to say that the only reason for the overloading is from illegal connections, but it is also from the densification of areas. And the bottom line is that neither municipalities nor Eskom actually want to invest in infrastructure in areas where people are not really paying for services because they can't afford to pay for services. So you have informal settlements like Zandspruit that have been there for decades that don't have access to electricity because nobody wants to electrify Zandspruit because they don't believe that there will be enough payment. So there very much is this two-tier system in terms of access to services, which then impacts how often you actually have the service and the reliability of that service.
Sure. Do you see a way of kind of bringing this research and the kind of policy suggestions you make to the state? And is there an opening for that kind of conversation around affordability, around expanding affordability, bringing households up to a developmental standard?
I think the one thing we've learned is if you want to have an impact on policy, you've got to pick one thing and then work on it for years and years and years. So we've been working on this for a long time, and especially the free basic electricity and the fact that 11 million households are funded each year in the budget for the free basic services, but only about 2 million households actually get all the services. And especially most households don't get the free basic electricity. And I think we are getting an opening now. I think we have found an audience in National Treasury, for example, who are quite disturbed by the fact that so much money goes to municipalities for the free basic services, but is in fact being used by municipalities for other things. They're not getting the benefits. When the president was here at the end of last year to initiate the presidential intervention in Joburg, he publicly raised this issue of the fact that in the city of Joburg, 1 million households are supposed to get the free basic electricity and only about 30,000 do. So he publicly raised that issue. Then that creates a kind of pressure that as a academic research organization, you can't. I think also the new Minister of Electricity and Energy and that new department has very much prioritized the issue of affordability of services. So I think what we've seen over the last year is that there's much more public discourse around the issue of affordability of services, whereas no one was really talking about that before. But it takes a long time to change policy. And in the current fiscal environment, and the fact that most municipalities are under financial distress, it's difficult. But at least now we're having an understanding that there is an affordability problem, that in fact the problem is not just, telling people to pay their services and then magically the money to pay for it will materialize. So it's still going to be a long journey, but I think we're definitely seeing that the public discussions around this issue are starting to change.
That's a massive gap in what's budgeted for and what actually gets delivered. I mean, 11 million, you said, to 3 million that actually have. And it seems to me that, like, at least from a budgeting perspective, it would be useful to kind of align what's going on there.
I think everyone agrees. Obviously, there's a problem with households not having access to sufficient water. But the most important issue is electricity, because there's such a big gap between the free basic electricity and what households need to pay for, and because electricity prices have gone up so much. So National Treasury has acknowledged that we need to increase the free basic electricity allowance. However, they do make the valid point that there's not much point in increasing the benefit if people are not actually getting it. So if 11 million households are funded for the benefit in the budget and only 2.5 million get it, increasing the benefit doesn't have that much thing. So there's a lot of discussion now about how we could change that. One of the problems is that the funding for the free basic services is included in the equitable share allocation to municipalities, which technically speaking is discretionary. So municipalities can't be forced to use the money for that purpose. But that then undermines the purpose of the entire policy. So our recommendation has been that we need to actually strip that benefit out of the equitable share so that it's no longer discretionary for municipalities whether they allocate that money at all. So I'm hopeful we can see an improvement there. I mean, even if we could just double the number of households that got the benefit, that would be 2.5 million households getting an extra 1,200 Rand a year in a benefit, which in a poor household is significant.
Yeah, it is significant, at least at the level it's conceived in current policy. It expands that basic level of access. Link all of this, we started here, but link all of this back to the just energy transition for us. I mean, we've gone into affordability, questions of dignity, questions of access and policy. So yeah, package this up for us. How does this conversation about access to basic services link to the just energy transition?
It depends very much how you define a just energy transition. So it's a bit of a generalization, but more of a global north definition of a just energy transition, which is that the justice applies to people who are adversely impacted by decarbonization of the economy. So those are people who work in the coal industry, people who work in coal-fired power stations, people who work in the fossil fuel industry. So it's primarily an employment issue. And then also, obviously, you have communities and local economies that are very tied to coal. So then the just energy transition is about how do you make sure that sort of the losers in the transition are taken care of. We don't think in a developing country context like South Africa that is a sufficiently wide definition. So we found it useful to think about the energy transition as comprising a journey and a destination, and that we need justice in both. And if we look at the definition of a just energy transition that talks about justice for people who work in the coal sector, for example, that's part of the energy transition journey. And we think that that is necessary, but not sufficient. Because what that definition does is that it in no way problematizes the existing energy system except for its carbon emissions. Whereas there are many equities in the system, mostly as we've been talking about, in access to electricity and access to energy. So we think it's as important to think about what does justice and equity look like in the destination that we're moving to. So how do we have not just equity in the transition, but how do we transition to a system that is more equitable?
Throughout the past 2 episodes, we have heard that access in South Africa is not just about connection. It is about power. Power over systems and resources, who gets to live with stability and who is left to endure uncertainty. From the everyday realities faced by households across the country to the systemic patterns that Tracy Ledger has unpacked, a truth emerges. Exclusion is not an accident. It is designed and written into the rules that govern that those who pay may get served and those who don't must go without. More than half of South African households live below the poverty line. For a family of 4, that means surviving on less than 6,500 rand a month. 1 in 4 families live below the food poverty line, their entire income unable to cover the calories that they need to survive. In that reality, affordability becomes the true measure of justice. Because if you cannot afford to turn on the light, fetch safe water, or keep your children fed and clean, then connection is only symbolic. Access in name, exclusion in practice. As Tracy Ledger says, South Africa's service model was designed to protect municipal revenue, not human dignity. It rewards payment before participation and punishes poverty with disconnection. The result is a system that rations access instead of expanding it. A system that treats electricity and water as commodities, not common goods. But justice demands something different. If the just transition is to mean anything at all, it must begin by reimagining the systems that decide who gets to live with dignity. Access without affordability is not access at all. The real transition begins when we stop managing scarcity and start designing justice. When energy, water, and land are recognized not as products to sell, but as the shared foundations of a society that works for everyone. In our next episode, we turn to that foundation, land, and ask whose land is powering this transition and what happens when the green economy takes root on ground that was never returned. I'm Tasneem Essop, and you've been listening to Just Access, The Real Transition, a podcast from PARI, the Public Affairs Research Institute. To learn more about PARI and their research, visit pari.org.za. If you found this episode useful, please like, follow, or subscribe, and share it with others, and keep listening.